Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of the Reconstruction era. In the previous lecture, we started talking about the process of the adjustment to freedom for the newly freed slaves. In this lecture, we continue that discussion, talking more about agency and the slaves controlling their own fate during this period, and less about the influence of outside groups like the Freedmen's Bureau. In the previous lecture, we talked about things that the freedmen sought out in the aftermath of slavery, including things like land of their own and jobs that would pay them wages, and how for most of the freedmen, those kind of aspirations were cut short, and the reality of life in the aftermath of slavery was a new system known as sharecropping. Let's continue our discussion of the kinds of things that freedmen sought out in the aftermath of slavery and how successful they were in attaining it. So one of the things that freed slaves sought above all else was education. They wanted independence, a taste of the forbidden fruit, if you will, a sense of equality with whites, and intellectual freedom. So, again, why are they seeking out education? Well, with education comes opportunity. Many of you who may be college students might be thinking the same kind of thing about your education. Why are you getting an education? Well, because that education will provide you with opportunities once you have graduated. There is also a sense of self-improvement. There doesn't necessarily have to be a means to an end. Education is a reward in and of itself. There also, with education, comes a sense of equality, and in particular, a sense of equality with whites. Education puts you on an equal footing with others. We talked in the previous lecture about sharecropping and how the sharecroppers were at a disadvantage if they didn't have the education and they didn't understand the math or couldn't read the contracts that were put in front of them. So with education comes equality. There is also a sense of freedom in education, an intellectual freedom, a freedom of the mind. And finally, many of the freedmen sought out education so that they could read the Bible. And that was one of the first books that the freedmen read. So again, one of the results of attaining education is that they were better equipped to combat the kind of corruption of the sharecropping system that I talked about in the previous lecture. There were a number of opportunities for education that freedmen could utilize. The American Missionary Association, which I mentioned previously, assisted in some cases, followed the Union Army through the South and set up schools in their wake, and also helped to establish several black colleges, some of which still remain today, colleges like Fisk, Hampton, Dillard, or Talladega. Blacks also built their own schools in some cases, and as we'll discuss in just a moment, black churches provided a source of education for blacks as well. But the Freedmen's Bureau also played a role, and Freedmen's Bureau schools sprang up all throughout the South, even down to the farthest reaches of Texas and Florida. Now, education in those schools, in many cases, had to adapt to the kind of resources that were available to them. Education for who? Who attended these schools? Well, it was a very interesting situation because if you think about it, slaves who had for the most part been denied an education resulted in young children, the elderly, and everybody in between all being on a similar footing in terms of education. So it was adults, men and women, children, the elderly, the infirm, everyone wanted an education. Most of the instruction was oral for a couple of reasons. One of them being that resources were in short supply. So books, paper, pencils, and other supplies were hard to come by in some cases. But also the freedmen were accustomed to listening. This was the instruction that they had had under slavery. They could tell stories. They could listen to their parents talking to them. There was also tremendous opposition to these Freedmen's Bureau schools and other opportunities for blacks to attain an education. In some cases, this might qualify as jealousy from whites who were also struggling to attain an education. But there was also the idea of keeping the blacks inferior and intimidated and not on an equal footing with whites. Teachers who came into these schools were intimidated. Black schools were targeted for attacks and sometimes burned or damaged. And it would be many, many years before blacks were able to attain an equal education in the South, and some would argue that even today there remain disparities in education. It's important to note that blacks did a great deal for themselves in this era. The Freedmen's Bureau and other agencies created by whites in the North and coming into the South were not able to penetrate all of the farthest reaches throughout every part of the South. And so in many small towns, villages, and even cities, blacks were left to themselves to develop institutions that could help them. One of the most noteworthy and powerful black institutions was the black church. And even in places where the Freedmen's Bureau never reached, the black church was a source of assistance, aid, and comfort to blacks. It was far more than just a place of worship, although that played an important role. It also had many other real-world and practical implications. It became a social center, a gathering place for blacks every day of the week, not just on Sundays and not only when the church was in session. It also became a source of leadership within the black community, providing training for the real world. And even today, many leaders in the black community come through the church. It was a source of education. And many of those black churches, when they were not acting as religious centers, set up informal or even formal classrooms for students of all ages to improve their education. The church was a place for entertainment and theater, serving as a rallying point for lectures, speeches, performances, poetry readings, and so on. And finally, and most important of all, the church was a source of pride for blacks, an organization run by and for blacks in a setting when there were few such places for them to gain a sense of pride. So as blacks made this adjustment to freedom, they did many things for themselves. They did a lot to help themselves. They also had assistance from the Freedmen's Bureau and other organizations. In the next lecture, we'll talk about how white Southerners responded as blacks made this adjustment to freedom.